One shocking stat is non-human identities typically outnumber human identities by 25 to 50x. Each of those is an attack vector, and that's probably going to get worse with AI. These risks haven't been addressed by the industries.
Lalit is a true trailblazer in the cybersecurity industry and founder of the Non-Human Identity Management Group. With over 25 years of pioneering work in this space, Lalit Choda isn't just an expert. He's earned the nickname Mr. NHI and is a sought-after keynote speaker, author of major white papers, research, and educational videos, including the recently published The Ultimate Guide to Non-Human Identities. In today's chat, we will discuss the critical importance of managing NHIs, the risk associated with them, and how AI is exacerbating these issues. If an attacker really got their hands on NHIs, what's the worst case scenario that makes you lose sleep?
My biggest fear is really with operational tech, the control systems that run core infrastructure, our services, healthcare, airlines, nuclear plants. I worry that as agentic AI starts coming in more and more, it starts making even more smarter decisions and taking on the functions that humans typically performing previously. That's really scary to me, that if an adversary can come in and start to compromise kind of operational technology and agentic AI systems, that's what scares me the most.
Welcome to AI Cyber Magazine.
Confidence, what an introduction. That's the best one I've heard so far.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So, before we really just dive deep into the chat, I was really curious about this nickname of yours. I really like it, Mr. NHI. So, can you please just maybe share with us, how did you come about that nickname? How did you come about being nicknamed Mr. NHI?
Sure, great question. Look, so I started my career in investment banking just over 30 years ago. And after about 5 years, SOX regulations came along and we needed to cycle passwords every 180 days. So 25 years ago, I got known as Mr. SOX. So that was my first name that I was known in sort of the banking industry. And then for the next 25 years, I started running major global regulatory and audit programs across IAM, PAM, and then ended up running some major programs in the non-human identity area. 4 years ago, I ended up establishing and running one of the largest cybersecurity programs around NHIs at an investment bank, dealing with hundreds of thousands of NHIs, a $20 million program. Got a lot of experience in NHIs. Last year, then I decided, look, if you're a customer, and you're worried about the risks of NHIs, you're a CISO, security practitioner, where do you go? Where do you get advice about this huge challenge? So last year I formed the Non-Human Identity Management Group, initially a community group that's now got 1,650 members. And then after that, I wrote a huge white paper, a practitioner's guide to how you manage non-human identity risks. After that, I then created the Non-Human Identity Management sort of community group portal, where we've got the most foundational articles on NHIs, white papers, breaches, research, blogs, and educational videos. And since then, sort of things have flourished, doing lots of keynotes, webinars, podcasts, and as you said, the most recent report we published, The Ultimate Guide to Non-Human Identities. And over the last few months, people in the industry started to call me Mr. NHI, and that's now stuck, being recognized as the #1 NHI influencer evangelist in the industry.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. So, you've been seeing the word NHI quite a lot. And I just want you to imagine where your grandma, right? And I want you to speak to us like that and break down for us what exactly are non-human identities, which for short is NHIs, and tell us why anyone should care about them.
Sure. I think in terms of simple terms, what is an NHI? It's an identity or an account that's needed to run sort of IT infrastructure, be that a machine, a device, your IoT infrastructure, sort of more commonly known within technology around sort of software that runs in an automated way without human intervention. These accounts are then used to run this software or these machines in an automated way, and then allow them to sort of operate and interact with other services, maybe a database, a SaaS service, use these accounts to, authorize, authenticate, and communicate across these processes within IT infrastructure. So I guess that's probably the simplest term or way to describe NHIs. These are accounts that are used to run software and machines as opposed to sort of human identity. Some examples will include API keys, tokens, service accounts, secrets, technical accounts, certificates, system accounts. Now, to your question, look, why do people need to be sort of concerned about non-human identities? They've been around since computers existed. The reality is most organizations have got very weak controls around managing these accounts. They don't even know how many they have. They become a very key attack vector to compromise systems and data. It's very, very challenging to kind of get these accounts under control and secure them. One shocking stat is non-human identities typically outnumber human identities by 25 to 50x, and that's probably going to get worse with AI. We're seeing lots of breaches now that are occurring using non-human identities. There was a report by Get Guardian that said in 2023, 12.8 million exposed secrets or credentials, non-human identities were found on GitHub. Attackers are now finding these credentials real time. We're now seeing huge exposure for organizations, not just because of exposures they have internally, but also with third-party supply chain dependencies. So there's a lot of third-party attacks that are now occurring. And then look, with Gen AI, this is going to increase significantly the exposure around NHIs and the risk associated with them.
That's very interesting. And thank you for breaking that down in such a way that you've given us examples, for example, of what NHIs are, and you've given us also why we should care about it. But I also want you to tell me, in your own view, what do you think are the core challenges organizations face when dealing with NHIs? What keeps you up at night?
Yeah, I mean, people say I'm crazy to be continuing to handle NHI risks and becoming an evangelist about them when it's probably the hardest challenge I think most people are going to face in their careers. As one of my CISO said a few years ago, fundamentally, look, what are the challenges? Look, today, most non-human identities are static in nature, right? So they've been created, they live for a very long time, and they're generally unmanaged. The biggest risk by far is that these static secrets or credentials are found hard-coded, and even in unencrypted form, in source code, in your Confluence, Slack channels. And most organizations don't even know how many they have. So even understanding the size of the problem, the fact that we've created 50x times human identities, these have been created over the last, decades. They're sitting out there. We don't know how many we have. We don't know who the owners are of these accounts. Many of them are stale. Like at a previous organization, we found 60% of NHIs were not used. They were created many years ago, performed a function, and just were left there because of lack of, life cycle processes that you typically get with human and with your IGA processes. Some of the other issues are humans then can use these accounts to bypass controls that have been put in place with like PAM and other processes. And then it's very hard to know that a human's actually using these accounts. If you know the password for an account to a database, you can just log in directly. These accounts typically have excessive privileges because they are performing, kind of quite important functions for, big applications. So that's why they're a key attack vector by hackers and even insiders. Some of the other big challenges are, where you've got, for example, passwords or API keys, they don't usually get cycled, right? So people can remember them when someone leaves your team or leaves an organization. If they know the credentials, they can still use them, inside and outside of their previous role. And then we have sharing of credentials across applications, lack of environment segregation, where the same account is found in prod and non-prod. And as we mentioned, huge third-party supply chain risks at the moment. So I think that's a scary set of, issues, challenges. But look, the reality is most organizations have really got no controls over these accounts today.
It's a cocktail of problems, and now I understand why you're very passionate about it. But what really struck me among the key point you really pulled out there was, if you put the fact that we pay so much attention to human identities and we're doing so much in onboarding and offboarding them properly,
Mm.
we also know that identities in that light have been used heavily. Human identities here have been used heavily by threat actors. So imagine that we have something else that is a form of identity that is twice the number of identities that are human, but then they're not given half the attention of human identities. I mean, for me, that's mind blowing and scary. So thank you for taking this on.
I mean, the reality is, though, once people kind of break in and maybe use a human identity to kind of get into an organization's systems or a third-party supply chain dependency, what do they do next? They look for non-human identities, right? That's how they start attacking, because the human identity will be under some PAM controls typically, so it's using those non-human identities, then doing lateral movement, getting to your key systems, your databases, and exfiltrating or causing damage, to those systems. So the heart of the attacks are always generally NHIs.
Interesting. But was there one defining moment or incident early in your career or at some point in your career that made you realize NHIs were an underestimated risk in cybersecurity?
Yeah, look, I did actually talk about this in detail in our Ultimate Guide to NHIs, but I'll actually go back to 25 years ago when we had SOX requirements. And I was obviously known in those days as Mr. SOX. What did we have to do, 25 years ago around non-human identities? There was a key requirement that was put in from a control standpoint that any non-human identities in those days, these were database accounts that applications would use to connect to a database to perform some function, that we had to cycle them every 180 days. Now, that proved to be a massive challenge for this particular global American investment bank because to cycle the passwords every 180 days, you would need to find where these passwords were being used in your code, in your scripts, and there could be hundreds of places where the password was being referenced in a hard-coded form. So if you can imagine, you need to just change one password maybe over a weekend, and there's 100 scripts that need to be changed. Imagine the coordination. Look, there are other techniques like you can create a new account and move to that and switch from the old one. But in 25 years ago, there were no secrets vault solutions around. I actually built my own custom one just to solve this problem. But the problem was every quarter we kept failing our SOX obligations around cycling passwords. It became a massive issue for the organization. And then in the end, I actually recommended to kind of senior management, look, we can't use password-based authentication. We need to move away from, hard-coded passwords, and we ended up moving to Kerberos authentication to authenticate. And then the other thing, clearly from a SOC standpoint, they only care about accounts that have write privileges that can update data. They're concerned about impact to books and records. So what we also did was we analyzed all the non-human identities that were out there, and many of them, again, overprivileged, given right privileges. And then when we analyzed the activity logs on the databases, we found nearly 80-90% of these accounts never did a write, they only did read. So we then did another big exercise to reclassify the accounts and make them read versus write. And by doing that, we massively reduced the surface area of risk. We reduced the requirement to cycle passwords because we brought down the number of write accounts. And then another issue we found was many of the NHIs were set up many, many years ago, never used. We then did logging monitoring, found over 1 million human and non-human accounts, right, across all of our environments that had not been used for over a year, and we blew away 1 million accounts. So those show you some of the kind of issues that you would get, with NHIs. And this was 25 years ago, and that's what got me so passionate about this topic. But the scary thing is, 25 years on, right, all these issues are still out there, and these risks haven't been addressed by the industry. So it really shocks me that we've not really moved forward 25 years later. and actually the problems got worse.
Why do you think we haven't moved forward as an industry on solving such an important problem?
I think before the focus was, well, one, many years ago, hacking was a lot harder to do, wasn't so prevalent in the industry. So it was more of an internal kind of threat issue. And whilst people knew about it, they focused more on, the human controls, IGA, and then kind of how do you protect your barriers of people coming in, data protection controls, and then putting in place kind of PAM solutions, right? So it was all about humans and controlling what they did. So this was always the big forgotten problem child, and everybody knew about it, but they knew it was very difficult to solve. So that's why it's been left out there, and also the tooling didn't exist. And even today, yes, we've got tooling, we've got PAM solutions, we've got secrets managers, but none of them really provide a cohesive solution for properly managing NHI risks from a full life cycle standpoint. So I think it's just because I would say it's the hardest problem to solve, and that's why it's kind of been left alone. But now you can't ignore it anymore, and I guess we'll talk about that in a minute, possibly.
Exactly. Just hold that thought there because I really want to come back to your thoughts about tooling that's available today in the industry. But you've mentioned in previous materials you've published, like your papers and the report you mentioned earlier on. In one of those, you said that AI is tipping NHI's risk over the edge. Can you unpack that for us? Is it a matter of scale, complexity, or something else entirely unpredictable?
Look, it's a good question. I think there's a number of reasons why AI is now tipping NHI risks over the edge. Now, clearly, if it's not obvious, any AI system will naturally need NHIs to operate. So all the issues that we've described about the risks of managing NHIs, when you now have got some powerful AI systems, LLMs, agents running, and they're inherently kind of exposed to huge exposures due to the NHI risks, that's clearly one of the big concerns. Look, scale, as we see exponential growth in AI systems within organizations and in the industry, they're all going to need to have more NHIs to operate them. I guess the current 50x prediction that we have on NHIs to humans, maybe we'll go to 75 or even 100 times human identities. Look, I think also as humans start using AI systems to perform complex tasks from prompts, now you can have AI write code for you on the fly without any programming skills. So once those are starting to execute within your environment, more NHIs might need to be created for every time someone kicks off some new process. Imagine 50,000 employees all kicking off different things within your AI infrastructure. They're all going to then spawn off new processes. Potentially that means new NHIs for each one of those things, maybe tied back to you as a human. Um, and I think then the other big thing is, look, AI systems are clearly going to be very powerful in what they can do in terms of the access that they're going to have to your data. So I think the risk with NHIs are already that they're overprivileged, but I think now AI-based NHIs are going to have super privileges, right, or superpowers that were probably never seen before in terms of their breadth of access, and that's really, really, really concerning. So it's going to be very important on how do we put in place the appropriate guardrails around NHIs and guardrails around just AI controls in general. But it's scary, and everybody's really concerned now about AI and the impact on NHIs.
Okay, so still just to really paint a very good picture of the challenges of NHIs and how it's such a big problem to solve and how that problem is evolving. I really want to bring you back to one of your white papers that I absolutely enjoyed, which is the white paper on managing non-human identity risk. Looking back at that paper that was published in 2023 and comparing that to today, is there one risk you highlighted in that paper that has evolved or worsened in ways that you hadn't anticipated?
Yeah, look, I think, as we said, the issue's been there and present for a very long time. We've talked about this hasn't really improved in terms of a control. But look, I think why has it got worse? in particular over the last 5+ years. I think the big turning point is the adoption of cloud, heavy reliance on SaaS services, and then the industry moving to sort of containerization, microservices, and API-based architectures, and then CI/CD pipelines and automation, and obviously now, AI, as we just discussed. So I think those changes have now really kind of exploded the use of NHIs. And like we said earlier, before it was more of an internal issue, right? It was accounts, NHIs you had internally within your organization. But now with cloud, SaaS, NHIs are now available and easily discoverable in public, like in GitHub, like we said, 12.8 million in 2023.
Whoa.
So it's really, really easy for kind of adversaries now to discover these credentials. There's just so many of them available, and we're seeing so many breaches now that are occurring. We did a big kind of article late last year calling out 40 NHI breaches that occurred in the last couple of years. So we're just seeing the exposure now of NHIs. They're now out in the wild, where previously they were more internal within an organization. So I think cloud, SaaS, and then just some of the other changes in the industry have just made the problem much, much worse.
I'd like you to really zoom into what you just said around breaches. Can you speak to us about one of those breaches where an NHI was used as possibly an attack vector and then that was somehow used to breach an AI system? Would you want to share one of those breaches that actually speaks to that?
Sure, there's lots to pick from. My favorite one from last year, and it has some overlap with AI as well. Permiso Security actually reported in October attackers had hijacked a large language model on the cloud to run rogue chatbot services, right? They actually leveraged some AWS access keys, these are obviously NHIs, to hijack an Anthropic model provided by AWS Bedrock. And they used that for dark role-playing activities, and including, unfortunately, impacting sort of minors. So that's really scary, right? The hijacking of LLM models using NHIs. Another one just in December was Microsoft Azure OpenAI service was breached by a hacking as a service group. Again, they used stolen Azure API keys and some other techniques to bypass some of the API AI guardrails, and they generated harmful content, including illegal material at scale. So again, this is really, really scary stuff, how NHI's AI is now being used to cause breaches and cause huge impact to day-to-day lives.
So, speaking about your article as well, your thought leadership piece that you shared for publishing in AI Cyber Magazine, you added the concept or spoke about the concept of secret sprawl. And for those who are not really familiar with these things, it can sometimes sound like it's something out of a spy movie, but it's a real threat, right? Can you explain what it is and why it's so dangerous in today's IT environment?
Good question. Look, I think we've kind of covered from the previous questions, and I guess probably people can guess what secret sprawl is, but it's really the growth in secrets and then NHI credentials, exponentially, over the last sort of 10 years, with the adoption of cloud, SaaS, microservices, API keys, CI/CD pipelines, and Gen AI. So it's really just the need for NHIs has exploded. So what we're effectively saying is secrets are getting sprawled. They're literally everywhere, because we've got such hyper fragmentation kind of within the industry, with many different cloud providers that you need to deal with. You've got many directory services, you've got many on-prem environments, many different endpoints, databases, and so you've got, hundreds of thousands of SaaS services that we depend on. For example, there's a stat that's quoted that an average organization has 300 third-party supply chain SaaS integrations. Each of those needs multiple NHIs. Each of those is an attack vector. Just with the way kind of our environments just got now more distributed, it's now required more and more secrets, NHIs, and that's what we mean by secret sprawl. They're now just everywhere. You can find them, you know, wherever you turn and look.
Interesting. But in your opinion, how is AI or how is the rise of AI pushing the boundaries of the NHI attack surface, as you've basically described that attack surface to be very wide?
Yeah, look, obviously we talked just briefly about some of the breaches that have occurred recently involving LLM models. With AI, there's a huge number of risks, inherent with kind of NHIs. I think a lot of it is to do with kind of core controls around identity and access management, given, you know, AI systems that use NHIs, they're going to have access to lots of sensitive data. And then, it's very easy for an attacker to start the hijacking kind of key control systems that are run by AI agents, or they can start using NHIs to start poisoning and introducing kind of malicious or tampered data, in the underlying databases or models that are being trained, that AI models are getting trained on, and they can use it to craft different inputs that can cause AI agents to sort of operate and misclassify what they do in terms of processing. So I think just AI, just in general, just the way it works, the fact that it's dependent on data and that data can now be manipulated. I think it can be much, much harder now, right, to kind of understand that your AI models and the underlying data could have been compromised. And you may not know for a very long time through the traditional methods of someone just going in, corrupting some data or stealing some data. Now, it can actually massively change the behavior of your AI agents that you're building due to just tricking them and using malicious data. So I think the risks now are getting really challenging of how do you put in place the appropriate guardrails around kind of LLM models and AI, agentic AI, to stop sophisticated attackers from taking advantage, taking over, and manipulating these AI systems.
Speaking about guardrails, I want us to be able to leave people that watch this with some very actionable insights. So I want you to tell me, if you had to pick top three strategies for countering AI driven threats that leverage NHIs, what would they be? And in a nutshell, what should organizations focus on right away that will give them the biggest bang for their buck and make the most impact in terms of improving the security posture of the organizations that has to do with NHIs?
Yeah, look, I think whilst there's many guardrails you can put in, I guess, around AI systems that are broader than NHIs, and I'm probably not the biggest expert on those. If we were to focus more on the things that relate to sort of non-human identities, I think the most important thing I think people should be concerned about as they're building out sort of the AI infrastructure is that you got to move away from static NHIs or secrets that are long-standing that can be discovered and compromised. So there's a big movement around clearly zero trust model and using kind of zero standing privileges, what we call ephemeral, just in time secrets or dynamic secrets. I think if you can have your AI infrastructure use kind of more of a zero trust model, then clearly it makes kind of things much, much harder to compromise because you don't have these static API keys that can be discovered and that can kind of compromise and take over your AI agents or other AI infrastructure.
Mhm. Just to double down on that, can you give us examples of dynamic options to static secrets?
Yeah, so like when you start up a piece of software, like a workload, it needs identity to operate an NHI. And in the past, you would use ones that you created and they would exist forever. Could be a certificate, it could be a key, could be a Kerberos ticket. So those are very static in nature. people know them, they can use them, they can abuse them if they know the credentials or passwords. So with dynamic credentials or ephemeral secrets, you're effectively generating your NHI credential to sort of start to operate that AI agent or that piece of software dynamically at runtime. So at runtime, it will start up and say, look, I need to get something, you have to have some level of trust around knowing what is it that's running, and then an NHI credential is given to you to sort of operate your software. Once your task is complete, that credential then is shut down and then is removed automatically. So if you're running some kind of immediate process to just do some ad hoc query, you get that dynamic secret and then it disappears. So the window of opportunity then for an adversary to kind of, take over and attack that AI software is very, very small, right? And again, with zero trust, you have to prove who you are. So someone else coming in trying to kind of take over becomes very, very hard. So clearly, this is the way we're moving as an industry, not just for NHIs, but for human identity as well. Clearly, as we've discussed, NHIs are inherently have high privileges or can be overprivileged. And I think standard IAM practices around role-based access control, it's very important that you only give the privileges that you need for your AI processes and limit what they can do in terms of access to sensitive data, the breadth of what they have access to. So clearly then if someone does get access to some AI infrastructure, the access that that has to its NHI is sort of limited. I think clearly monitoring controls are going to be quite important to look for anomalies, where you see different behavior, different inputs, into your agent, different, paths or sources of where the requests are coming in. And then I think just more fundamental things that I think are broader than just NHIs. I think clearly fundamental things like making sure your data is encrypted, both kind of in transit and rest. So it's hard for, if someone gets access to your systems, they can't actually understand the data that's being produced, without appropriate decryption keys.
Awesome. So you've spoken a lot about attacks, and we all agree that the new perimeter in cybersecurity is identity. And we know that over 80% of breaches are identity related. So if an attacker really got their hands on NHIs, I want you to paint to us what's the worst case scenario that makes you lose sleep.
Clearly, NHIs have huge issues that once they're discovered and compromised, they can cause massive impact to any organization. But my biggest fear, I think, by far, is really with kind of operational tech, sort of control systems that run kind of our core infrastructure, our services, kind of healthcare, airlines, nuclear plants. I worry that, and even obviously those systems leverage IoT devices, that as, those systems evolve, as, agentic AI starts coming in more and more, and it starts making even more smarter decisions, and taking on the functions that humans were typically performing previously. That's really scary to me that, you know, you've got your standard operational tech, you then get agentic AI on top of that, that starts taking over humans' functions, at least with humans, there's key controls, right? Of they've got a job to do, right? But as to some of the issues we've talked about, if an adversary can come in and start to compromise kind of operational technology and agentic AI systems, that's what scares me the most, to be honest. Look, we actually had a big survey that our group did probably a couple of months ago about what was the biggest use case concern around NHIs. And 57% said we're worried about service accounts, 28% said we're worried about API keys and tokens in SaaS environments, and only 7% said we're worried about NHIs that are used in IoT devices, and 8% were concerned in robotic RPA bots. So what that tells me is that there's a lot of focus on kind of cloud, SaaS, service accounts, but operational tech, and IoT devices, which are core to, huge parts of our industry, didn't come up top. So I think they're underrepresented, understood, and I think that's a concern because if people aren't thinking about protecting those kind of things, then I think we could be more heavily exposed to attacks, adversaries to some of those operational tech and IoT based devices and
And I couldn't agree
infrastructure.
more with you, because even if we're to look at frameworks like GDPR and NIST, they weren't built with AI-driven NHIs in mind. So my next question would be, if you could rewrite global regulations, what's the one non-negotiable policy you would put in place?
Yeah, it's a good, tough question. I think it would have to be what we discussed earlier. I would say, any AI model that's produced must operate using zero trust principles. The challenges with NHIs for most organizations are, as we said, they're static. There's a lot of work you need to do to kind of get those risks under control. But the new kind of exciting stuff, the strategic stuff, we shouldn't be cutting corners there, and we should be mandating that we have very, very tight controls using zero trust philosophy to sort of manage kind of AI infrastructure would be kind of the one thing I would put into those global regulations.
Awesome. And you spoke about tooling earlier on. So it really just brings me to this question I'm about to ask, which is that we clearly see that there's a surge of venture capital flowing into AI driven anything. And AI driven security startups are just having a field day. So I want to ask for your thoughts. If you had to take a bet on just one emerging NHI security innovation, which one would you back and why?
The investment in AI is clearly obvious, but again, in our report that we published recently, there's been a massive VC investment in NHI companies or companies that are now building NHI capabilities. We assessed 400 million in VC funding went into these companies just in 2024. And we've already seen in January close to 50 million investment in these NHI companies in Series A funding. So that clearly shows you from a tooling perspective, even just more broadly for NHIs, there's a huge gap in the market. And so many folks have come in to sort of help address the fact that the existing tool sets that we have with IGA and PAM aren't really suited um, and built to deal with the NHI problems. But to your question, I would say if there was one thing in terms of security innovation, well, that would have the biggest bang for the buck. I think real-time threat detection and protection is key. Look, I think it's really hard for organizations to fully resolve all the issues like with the static NHIs that are out there, and it's a multi-year program to fix that. So I've spoken to a lot of CISOs, and there's a number of companies now are now thinking about focusing on the real-time threat detection and protection. That whilst you might be taking some time to fix the underlying issues, how do you stop the bleeding? How do you stop the attacks? How do you stop humans doing inappropriate things with NHIs? I don't think anyone's really truly solved the real-time threat detection and protection. And I
Okay.
think that's what people are looking for is how do we implement prevent controls to stop people in their tracks. But that's
Okay, so
very hard to do.
yeah, and you've spoken about, for example, how CISOs are struggling with that. So I want us to really double down in because I mean, I read your ultimate guide to non-human identities, and I clearly saw how you outlined the struggle of securing NHIs at scale, which is what you're speaking about. What are the biggest technical roadblocks we still haven't cracked? I mean, you've mentioned one of them, which is monitoring, but are there any other very serious technical roadblocks? Again, you mentioned some other thing, which is the static. NHIs. Even if you want to double down on those that are the biggest technical roadblocks that we still haven't cracked.
Yeah, look, I think static secrets is by far the biggest technical roadblock. Getting an inventory of them is very challenging. Most organizations don't have the inventory. If you think about typical lifecycle processes, we don't know who owns the accounts, right? Just doing those two things is super critical so you know the size of the problem. And then how do you take a risk-based approach to tackling this elephant in the room? And it's a multi-year problem. How do you provision and make sure that these static secrets aren't just shared back to a human and put in, source code, hard coded? How do you make sure that they go straight into a secrets vault? Where you do have hard coded credentials in source code, you then need to move them painstakingly into a vault and ensure you don't cause operational impact. And you could have hundreds of thousands of code snippets that are using secrets hard coded that you then move into a vault. That is no small undertaking. At a previous org, we probably spent tens of millions doing that. You then got to look at kind of posture management. How can you reduce the risk exposure, inactive accounts, clean them up, excessive privileges, sharing of accounts, environment segregation? The list goes on, and then obviously monitoring, and then really what you want to get to target state from a lifecycle standpoint is to that nirvana, prevent zero trust, stop people checking in secrets into source code, and there are solutions that can stop you doing that. But look, also, I would say there's a organizational imperative to kind of educate, their staff about the risks of NHIs. I think people understand them. But if there's one thing I would suggest is focus on policies, standards, controls, and make it very clear the rules of the road to the organization around static secrets, that you can't leave them lying around in source code. They need to be in a vault solution. Look, at a previous org, we got so strong on the messaging that we even said to staff, if you continue to check in this code into source code, it will lead to disciplinary kind of action, including termination. Right? That's how serious this problem is for organizations.
Interesting. So NHIs operate in a way that makes logging and auditing a real headache. We've established that in this conversation. But
Mm.
what are the key challenges in maintaining visibility over AI-driven NHIs, and how can security teams better manage this?
Yeah, look, I think just dealing with monitoring controls around NHIs is super challenging. I haven't seen anyone in the industries that solve this problem. Even I, in the program I ran at an investment bank recently, we invested so much effort in monitoring controls, and the usual challenges. How do you see the wood from the trees? There's lots of false positives. And how do you detect a human using an NHI versus some inappropriate other kind of adversary or system coming in using NHIs? I think with AI, things just go on to another level of complexity, because it's not just about have someone inappropriately compromise the NHI, but have they then use that to change the behavior of your AI infrastructure, your agents, whether that's from kind of identity spoofing, data poisoning, model evasion, inference attacks, and data exfiltration. I think it's just made the whole problem around monitoring controls of NHIs and then just AI infrastructure in general just even, much more challenging. I'm not sure I've seen any clear, obvious solutions out there today. I think it's a big maturing space, but I think fundamentally you need to have some basic monitoring controls in place. That's probably even more laser focused on your AI infrastructure than maybe the rest of your infrastructure. And you need to take any kind of kind of anomalies that you see much more seriously with the AI space than maybe some of your other estate that you're managing.
Awesome. So, as we begin to wind down the conversation, I want us to begin to have conversations about the future. So, looking ahead to OWASP's non-human identities top 10 that we currently have, is there one risk you foresee emerging in 2026 version of that same top 10 that isn't on today's radar?
We actually produced a top 10 list about a year ago through our NHI management group, and then recently some great work was done in the industry to come up with the OWASP top 10. Look, I think combined it's pretty comprehensive, but look, I think the one thing that is going to become a bigger and bigger problem and isn't yet covered in the OWASP top 10, I think is they talked about insecure authentication in the top 10, but I think with quantum computing threats and then with the AI overlay, right, where threat actors can then use quantum computing and AI to break all of our existing modern encryption standards, right, that we use to securely communicate and access data is probably a big concern that's going to become a real problem. So, the fact that you think you're safe because you've got strong encryption, authentication that can now be broken very easily by quantum computing, I think that will be my suggestion to add to maybe OWASP in 2026.
That is a very interesting suggestion you just made, and really launches us straight on to talking about what I can possibly guess as the answer to this question, but I might just as well just ask you. So, fast forward 5 years from now, what breakthrough are you most eager to see that could tip the scales in favor of security teams?
Good question. Okay, I think as we discussed, I think maturity around zero trust and standards and moving to sort of those zero standing privileges. Look, I think we need to rely heavily on standards and maturity of how we deal with zero trust and NHIs. Look, but I think back to static secrets, they're going to be here for a very long time. It's great to always talk about future state and zero trust, but most organizations may take 5 years, 10 years plus to kind of get to those target states. And I always think about what's the real and current present danger that's going to get the biggest attack surface. So I think from an AI standpoint, and I talked about this in our 20, 25 predictions for ultimate report on NHIs. Look, I think if AI could help massively deal with the whole static NHI problem and find them, secure them, rotate them, without human intervention and not cause operational impact along the way, I think that could be massive for the industry. The attackers are going to start leveraging AI to exploit NHIs more and more. I think we will see a lot more stronger defenses around just life cycle processes, monitoring controls, and the real-time threat detection that I think will, come through in leaps and bounds in the next sort of 4 or 5 years. And then I think finally, as we get to the zero trust model, I think the distinction between human identities and non-human identities, and there's a lot of debate about that at the moment around why do we have different tools and solutions. I think as we move to a zero trust model, everything's about an identity and getting that, authenticated, authorized. I think we'll see convergence, identity convergence, tool convergence, and then that will be something that will be massive for the industry and for organizations, right? Because organizations hate having to buy and integrate more and more products in this hyper fragmented environment. So I think simplicity and consolidation, I think, will be a big breakthrough through zero trust in the next 5 years.
Awesome. So, Mr. NHI, to close out, I want to hear about what exciting developments or insights we can expect from you in the next 6 months.
Yeah, look, the first sort of 6 months, second half of last year just was crazy for our growth. But look, we're doing some big things and some exciting things over the next 6 months. We're fortunate to be co-hosting the first ever global NHI summit at the iconic NASDAQ building in Times Square with a number of partners. So that's going to be a full day on-site event, the first time it's ever been done in the industry to help educate and allow organizations to walk away with ideas on how to start thinking about tackling this huge risk within their organization. I was also been fortunate to land a massive opportunity at Identiverse, which is the largest identity conference kind of globally in Mandalay Bay in Vegas in early June. So our group is going to be hosting a massive NHI summit, and also on the business floor there's going to be a NHI pavilion, and we're expecting 20 to 30 vendors there. So again, this will be massive for the industry to learn about the NHI problem, learn about some of the products that are in the industry, and we can really then help organizations start to get in front of this problem. And I think finally, look, our goal, our mission statement of the Non-Human Identity Group is to continue to be the number one research and advisory organization in the industry. Look, some people now call us the mini Gartner of NHIs, which I think is a nice compliment. And we want to continue to publish the best and most comprehensive content on NHIs, and just be the go-to organization that organizations come to for independent guidance and advice. So that's our goal, is to continue to educate, evangelize, and continue to be Mr. NHI.
Thank you so much for spending time with us and just opening up our eyes to the dangers of not paying enough attention to NHIs and protecting them. Thank you so much for your very eye-opening article also that's coming out on the spring issue of AI Cyber magazine. And thank you for your time. Thank you, Mr. NHI.
Thanks, Confidence, and again, thanks for all the great work you do within the industry.
Awesome.
You're a great role
Thank you so
model
much.
that I look up to.
Thank you so much.